I was still folding my wet umbrella when my mother looked up from her wine and said, "Didn't know they let charity cases in here." The words stung worse than the freezing rain I'd just run through. A few aunts laughed softly, like it was a punchline they'd all heard before. I didn't say anything. Just gave a tight nod like I understood. Hung my damp coat on the rack. And took the empty chair at the far end of the table. The one everyone avoided because of the draft. I told myself I was just there for an hour. Make an appearance. Then fade back into my own life. That was the routine. My name is Jolie. I'm 34 now. This was last fall. At my brother's engagement party. Technically, it was at the country club his fiancée's family belonged to. But we all knew who was footing the bill. My family doesn't do warmth. Growing up in our house meant learning to absorb passive aggression like a sponge and to never, ever celebrate your own victories too loudly. My parents weren't overtly cruel. No screaming matches. No slammed doors. But they were masters of the quiet dismissal. The subtle undermining. They could chip away at your confidence with a single, well-placed sigh. I left business school after the first year. That's the story they've told themselves ever since. It doesn't matter that I left because the ethical investment fund I started in my apartment was getting more traction than I could handle while studying for finals. It doesn't matter that the fund now manages over $900 million in assets. To them, I quit. I was too soft for the real world of finance. I'm the family's cautionary tale. Whenever my name comes up, it's followed by that disappointed head shake. The one that says, imagine if she'd just stuck with the program. I almost never go to these things. The last time I saw them was 2 years ago. When my father asked if I was still playing with my little hobby fund. I had just been featured on the cover of a major financial magazine. I remember just staring at him, wondering if he was being deliberately cruel or just willfully ignorant. Either way, I said nothing. I've learned silence is easier. It creates less friction. And it stops me from giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. But this time, my brother, Daniel, had called me himself. He was always the diplomat. The one who tried to build bridges over the moats my parents dug. He said he missed me. That it was important I be there. He even said Mom and Dad were proud of me in their own way. Against all my better judgment. I believed him. So I showed up. 10 minutes late. Hoping to miss the initial round of performative greetings. The ballroom was dripping with crystal and faded floral arrangements. And for a second, seeing Daniel wave at me, I thought maybe this time would be different. But then my mother's voice cut through the air. I didn't know they let charity cases in here. No, hello. No, I'm glad you came. Just that. I could have walked out right then. I should have. But something kept me there. A stubborn refusal to be chased out of my own brother's celebration. Maybe I was just tired of letting them have the last word. The dinner was a masterclass in polite exclusion. My cousin was bragging about his new promotion at a hedge fund. My uncle was holding court about a real estate deal. No one asked me about my work. Which was fine by me. It was a relief. Then, during the dessert course, Daniel clinked his glass for a toast. After he and his fiancée said a few words, my father stood up. He spoke about legacy. About building something that lasts. About the pride he had in Daniel for following the family path. The subtext was as subtle as a sledgehammer. That's when David, my future brother-in-law, leaned toward me. He's a nice guy. A portfolio manager at a big investment bank. We'd never really talked much. So, what do you do again? Jolie, he asked. His tone genuinely curious. I was tired. So tired of being vague. Of downplaying. Of shrinking myself. To fit in their little box. I run an investment fund. I told him. He nodded politely. Oh. Cool. Anything I might have heard of. I took a sip of water. Then I told him the name. The Vance Foundation. He blinked. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. Like he was seeing me for the first time. Wait. He said. His voice dropping. Your time's J. Vance asterisk. The table went quiet. Not just our end of it. The whole table. Forks paused midair. Daniel stared at me. His mouth slightly open. It was the first time I realized. Nobody knew. Not even my brother. I looked at David. My expression unreadable. It's my middle name. I said. And my grandmother's last name. He let out a short, shocked laugh. You're kidding me. He shook his head in disbelief. I've been trying to get a meeting with J. Vance for 6 months. The silence stretched. Thick and uncomfortable. My father's face was a storm of confusion. Then disbelief. Then something that looked a lot like anger. My mother just stared. Her perfectly painted smile frozen in place. No one said a word. I picked up my fork, took a bite of cake, and let them all sit with it. But that was just the beginning. The second, David pulled out his phone, and the hushed whispers started spreading down the table. The entire night began to unravel. And trust me, they hadn't even brought out the coffee yet. David stared at me like I was a ghost. Under the table. The glow of his phone was a beacon of confirmation as he scrolled. Undoubtedly through financial news sites. Maybe our foundation's public filings. I knew what he was seeing. My bio. Carefully curated to use my professional name. J. Vance. Was right there. Founder and Chief Investment Officer. The title they would have laughed at. He looked up. His face a mixture of awe and embarrassment. You're Jolie Vance, he whispered. Loud enough for Daniel to hear. As in, the mall Jolie Vance. Daniel turned to him. Then to me. What are you talking about? I could feel every eye at the table on me now. The cousins. The aunts. The future in-laws. Most had stopped even pretending to eat. David gave a nervous laugh. As if he still couldn't quite believe it. Jolie's Foundation. It's one of the most successful ESG funds in the country. They're famous for backing startups that everyone else overlooks. He trailed off, the gears turning in his head. Trying to connect the woman in a simple black dress at the end of the table with the titan of industry he'd been reading about. Daniel's eyes were wide. You run that whole thing, Jolie. You never told me. I shrugged. My voice quiet, but firm. You never asked? He sat back, processing it. David was still shaking his head. And I could see the exact moment it dawned on him that the quiet, dismissed sister of his future brother-in-law was one of the most powerful people in his field. My father finally broke his silence. It wasn't a cheer or a congratulations. It was a dry, dismissive scoff. The one he used whenever someone else's success threatened his own ego. So what? You run some little do-gooder fund. That's not real finance. That's a charity with a brokerage account. There it was. The immediate attempt to minimize. To put me back in my box. I started it with the $80,000 Grandma Vance left me. I said calmly. It went public 3 years ago. My mother finally spoke. Her voice laced with accusation. Well? You certainly kept it a secret. You could have told us instead of letting everyone think. Think what I asked. The edge in my voice impossible to miss. That I was a failure. That I couldn't cut it. The air crackled with tension. I didn't correct anyone because none of you ever asked. You wrote my story for me the day I left business school. And you weren't interested in any other version? I hadn't meant to say it all. But the words just came pouring out. My father put his glass down with a sharp click. Don't be so dramatic. Jolie, if we treated you differently, it's because you acted differently. You abandoned the family. You didn't want to be a part of what we've built. No, I said, my voice shaking slightly but steady. I just got tired of being told my way was worthless, because it wasn't your way. The atmosphere in the room had curdled. Daniel looked down at his plate. David looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. But the moment of truth didn't last. My uncle jumped in, trying to salvage the evening with a booming, fake laugh. Well, look at that. Our little Jolie is a big shot. Maybe you can give us all some stock tips. A few people gave relieved chuckles, desperate to break the tension. But it made my heart ache. That's how it always was. The second something real was said, they buried it under a joke. Deflect. Dismiss. Move on. Except this time, I wasn't moving on. I could. I said, my voice clear and cold. But I won't. That shut them up. I'm not here for your approval. I came tonight because my brother asked me to. But if this is how it's always going to be, then I'll save you the trouble of inviting me next time. My father scoffed again. There she goes. Always so sensitive. And that's when it happened. The final, unforgivable strophe. My mother, still smiling that brittle smile, reached into her purse. Well, since we're all sharing, we were going to give this to you for your birthday next month. But now seems like a good time. She slid a thin envelope across the table. I opened it. Inside was a brochure. For a local community college. For a certificate program in bookkeeping. We just thought, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. It might be nice for you to have some practical skills to fall back on. Something stable. The room was utterly silent. Even David looked horrified. I stared at the brochure. At the smiling faces and the promises of a secure future. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just placed the brochure on the table, folded my napkin, and stood up. As I walked away, I heard my father's voice behind me, dripping with contempt. See, can't even take a bit of helpful advice. That was the last time I saw them. At least for a while. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that their petty cruelty that night didn't break me. It ignited something. Because I wasn't their charity case anymore. I was a force they had ignored for far too long. And for the first time in my life, I was about to use my power. When I stepped out into the cool night air, I wasn't just walking away from a party. I was walking away from a lifetime of being made to feel small. The sting of humiliation was still there. But underneath it, a cold, hard resolve was beginning to form. This wasn't just about a brochure. It was about the pattern. The systematic erosion of my worth that had been their family pastime for over a decade. 3 weeks before that disaster of an engagement party, I was in a dusty town in rural Ohio, finalizing a deal to fund a new solar panel factory. It was a project the big banks had laughed at. But our models showed it would not only be profitable within 5 years, but it would also create 200 jobs in a community that desperately needed them. That's what I do. That's the life I built. I started it with that small inheritance from my grandmother, just $80,000. But it was everything. I did it all under her name. Vance. As a tribute. But also, as a shield. A way to build my world, without my family's shadow hanging over it. My parents come from old money. Ruthless corporate raiders, who saw compassion as a liability. I grew up in a sterile penthouse apartment overlooking the city. A place where profits were celebrated, and people were just numbers on a spreadsheet. My brother, Daniel, embraced it. He was groomed from birth to take over my father's firm, Sterling Holdings. Then there was me, the daughter, who, at a family dinner at age 20, announced she believed in socially responsible investing. You're spitting on your grandfather's legacy. My father had seethed, his voice like ice. But he was wrong. My grandmother, the one whose name I now used, had once whispered to me, "Don't ever let them convince you that kindness is weakness. Jolie, it's the only thing that's real." The day after the party, I was sitting in my corner office, staring out at the city skyline, when my assistant buzzed. A courier had delivered a thick legal envelope. Inside was a cease and desist letter from Sterling Holdings' legal team, accusing the Vance Foundation of predatory investment tactics in the clean energy sector, a sector my father's firm was heavily invested in through fossil fuels. It was baseless. Absurd. But tucked behind it was something far more personal. It was a notice that my father was calling in a family loan. A loan I didn't even know existed. Apparently, 20 years ago, my grandmother had used some family capital as collateral to secure the trust she left me. It was a legal loophole, and he was exploiting it. He demanded repayment of the original $80,000, plus 2 decades of exorbitant, compounded interest. The total came to nearly $3 million. It wasn't about the money. He knew I could pay it. It was about control. It was a message times. You are not your own person. Everything you have is because of us. And we can take it away. That was his mistake. He thought he was reminding me of my place. He had no idea he was giving me the justification I needed to tear his world apart. Monday morning was gray and cold, matching my mood. I didn't call my lawyers. Not at first. I called my head of research, a brilliant forensic accountant named Marcus, who could find a missing penny in the Vatican's budget. "I want you to dig into Sterling Holdings," I said. my voice calm and even. Every deal. Every filing. Every subsidiary for the last 10 years. I want to know everything. Discreetly. He didn't ask why. He just said, on it. While Marcus and his team worked, I dealt with my father's public attack. The cease and desist was a clear attempt to spook my board and my investors. He was trying to paint me as a reckless amateur. So, I went on the offensive. I booked an interview on the most influential financial news network in the country. I didn't mention my family. I didn't have to. I laid out the Vance Foundation's entire philosophy, backing it up with hard data, showing our returns, our growth, and the success of the companies we'd backed. I spoke about the future of energy, about the inevitability of the shift away from fossil fuels. Some firms, I said, looking directly into the camera, are stuck in the past. They see innovation as a threat, and when they feel threatened, they resort to baseless attacks and intimidation. But the future doesn't wait for those who are afraid of it. The interview was a massive success. Our stock ticked up. My investors were reassured. I had professionally, publicly, neutralized his attack without ever saying his name. But that was just the defensive move. My real plan was just getting started. 2 weeks later, Marcus walked into my office and shut the door. He looked pale. "You're not going to believe this," he said, placing a thick binder on my desk. "Sterling Holdings isn't just in trouble. It's a house of cards." He walked me through it. My father hadn't just made a few bad investments. He had been using new investor money to pay off old investors for years, propping up the illusion of success. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, masked by the firm's blue-chip reputation. The clean energy smear wasn't just a petty attack, it was a desperate act. He needed to destabilize the market, to scare my investors into pulling their money so he could trigger a downturn and cover his tracks in the chaos. But that wasn't the worst of it. The real twist was hidden in a web of offshore shell corporations. My father had been systematically embezzling from the company pension fund. He'd stolen from his own employees. Hundreds of them. People who had given their entire careers to his company. "There's enough here to put him away for the rest of his life," Marcus said quietly. I stared at the documents. At the cold, hard proof of his crimes. The brochure he'd given me. The charity case comment. And the loan. It all clicked into place. This was never just about his disapproval of me. It was about his own terror. He was a fraud. And he was terrified that I, the daughter he'd written off, was building something real, while his own empire was rotting from the inside out. My first instinct was to call the SEC, to hand it all over. But then I stopped. An anonymous tip would put him in jail. Yes. But it wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't help the people he'd robbed. And it wouldn't change the narrative he had controlled for so long. He was hosting his annual Sterling Foundation Gala in 3 days. It was the biggest philanthropic event of the year, where he paraded his generosity in front of the city's elite, the same people who had smirked and laughed at me my whole life. I looked at Marcus. "Get me the SEC's head of enforcement on the phone. Tell her Jay. Vance has a proposal, but we're not moving until Friday night." Friday arrived. Glittering and cold. The grand ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel was a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. My father stood on a raised dais, a portrait of success and benevolence, flanked by my mother and my brother, Daniel. He was about to give his keynote address. The pinnacle of the evening. The crowd, a collection of the city's most powerful and influential people, hung on his every word. I arrived late. Not with a date, but with Marcus and 2 quietly dressed individuals who were, in fact, senior agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission. We didn't enter through the main doors. We used a service entrance and waited in the wings of the stage. My father was in the middle of a self-congratulatory speech about corporate responsibility. "It is our duty, as leaders of industry, to uphold a standard of integrity," he was saying, his voice resonating with false sincerity. That was my cue. I walked out from the wings and stepped onto the stage. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. My father stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in shock and then narrowing in fury. "Jolie, what is the meaning of this security?" I ignored him and walked calmly to the second microphone on the lectern. "Good evening," I said, my voice ringing out through the silent hall. "My father is right. It is about integrity. Which is why I'm afraid I have to make an announcement. The crowd was murmuring now. A buzz of shock and intrigue. Daniel was staring at me, his face pale with confusion. My mother looked like she might faint. For the past decade, I continued, my voice steady and clear, Sterling Holdings has been a pillar of our financial community. But that pillar, I'm afraid, is hollow. I looked directly at my father. It has been operating as a Ponzi scheme. A collective gasp went through the room. My father laughed. A sharp, panicked bark. She's delusional. This is a pathetic cry for attention from a deeply troubled young woman. Not delusional, I said, holding up a file Marcus had handed me. I have facts. And I have witnesses. I gestured to the two agents, who now stepped forward from the wings, their badges clearly visible. Sterling Holdings is insolvent, and its founder, my father, has embezzled over $60 million from his own employees' pension fund. Horror spread across the faces in the audience. The agents walked calmly toward my father. Richard Sterling, the lead agent said, her voice devoid of emotion. You are under arrest for securities fraud, Wirefraud, and embezzlement. As they put the cuffs on him, his mask of civilized charm finally shattered. He lunged toward me, his face contorted with pure, undiluted hatred. You ruined me, he screamed, his voice cracking. You ungrateful little... No, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying in the dead silent room. You ruined yourself when you started stealing from people who trusted you. I'm just balancing the books. 6 months later, I stood in a crowded community center in that same town in Ohio where I'd funded the solar panel factory. The factory was open and thriving. The center was the first project of the new Vance Sterling Foundation. The trial had been swift. My father was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. I attended the sentencing. He refused to look at me. My mother filed for divorce and moved to Europe. Daniel, to my surprise, had stepped up. The collapse of Sterling Holdings had been brutal. But he worked with the receivers, doing everything he could to help the employees his father had betrayed. 3 weeks after the sentencing, he showed up at my office. He looked tired, but lighter. I read the whole file, he said, not meeting my eyes. Everything he did, everything you uncovered. He finally looked up. I'm so sorry, Jolie, for everything. I was so busy trying to win his approval. I never even saw you. We're slowly, carefully, trying to build something real. A relationship based on truth, not expectations. The assets from Sterling Holdings were liquidated. After the employees were made whole, there were millions left. I used that money, my so-called inheritance, to start the new foundation. We don't just fund companies, we rebuild communities. Last week, I received a letter. It was from my father. In prison. It contained only 5 words. Asterisk, you should have stayed quiet. I pinned it to the board in my office. A reminder that victory isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about having a truth so strong. It doesn't need to shout. This morning, a young woman we funded, the founder of a biotech startup, called to tell me their new water purification system was successful. That phone call, the hope in her voice, was worth more than any legacy Richard Sterling could have ever imagined. If you're watching this, and you've ever been made to feel small, like your dreams don't fit into someone else's plan for you, remember this. The compassion and vision my family saw as a weakness became the very strength that brought down an empire of deceit. Your worth is not defined by those who dismiss you, but by the world you choose to build. My name is Jolie Vance, and I'm the daughter my family thought was worthless. Today, their stolen fortune is building a better future. That is my inheritance. That is my truth. If this story means something to you, please like this video. Share it with anyone who needs to be reminded that your path is your own, and it is valid. And comment below with your own story of how you found your strength when others doubted you.